Don Taylor, Bob Marley's manager, gives a harrowing account of the things Rita suffered at the hands of Bob. He recounts how he personally witnessed Bob beat Rita because she requested child support. This attack was so vicious that it destroyed the hotel room where Bob and Rita were staying, requiring Bob to pay a hefty repair bill. Everyone knows that Bob Marley had a prolific love life, but there are a lot of misconceptions about his marriage. People believe that him and his wife had an open relationship, but this couldn't be any further from the truth. It was an open relationship for Bob only. For his wife Rita, it was a relationship of abuse, neglect, and humiliation. What's interesting to me is how Bob Marley's personal life is a complete contradiction to his public persona. Publicly, Bob represented a man who fought for the rights of the African diaspora, a religious man who spread the teachings of Rastafarianism around the world. I always felt like this tacitly implied a veneration for Black women. And though Bob married a Black woman and slept with many Black women and fathered many Black children with these women, for the most part, he treated these women as less than, especially in relation to his white mistresses. Bob's wife Rita and his mother Cedella are very similar in many ways.
You know, some resemblance of me and Rita. And
I see that too.
yes,
actually.
you know, because a lot of people would think that Rita is my daughter more than Bob, my son. I guess what you have seen, you know, in her, and he used to tell me how much she's, you know, she's a like, and she's a Leo like yourself, you know.
The relationship that Bob Marley had with his wife in many ways mirrored the relationship Cedella had with her first husband, Bob's father, Norval Marley. So right now, I want to go back and focus on the relationship between Cedella and Bob's father, Norval. Cedella met Norval when she was only 15 years old. Norval Marley was a plantation overseer, and Cedella was the daughter of a prominent farmer and bush doctor in 9 Mile. Their entire courtship is very creepy. In her book, Bob Marley, My Son, she recounts how Norval, a 60-year-old man at the time, would pinch her nipples when she'd see him. Unsurprisingly, Norval was incredibly emotionally manipulative towards Cedella. He would show her a lot of attention, bring her gifts, and shower her with affection so long as she did what he wanted. If she refused, he would ignore her and go out of his way to make her feel bad about herself. In one occasion, seeking Norval's approval, Cedella climbed out of her window in the middle of the night and went to Norval's house. The two ended up sleeping together, and Norval told Cedella to keep the relationship a secret, which is another classic grooming technique. Eventually, Cedella's father found out about their relationship, but instead of getting upset, he consented to his 15-year-old daughter sleeping with a 60-year-old man. According to Cedella, her father had also had an affinity for much younger women. This was something that him and Norval seemingly bonded over. The two of them were very good friends, and he would frequently take Norval's side when his daughter and Norval would argue. Their relationship had a lot of dark undertones. As a white Jamaican, Norval was the descendant of the planter class. Planters were the English slave owners who ran the sugar and tobacco plantations in Jamaica. Fittingly, Norval was extremely controlling. In an incident which parallels a lot of the dark racial history of Jamaica, Cedella recounts how Norval forbade her from attending church. Just as in most of the African diaspora in Jamaican society, religion is a very important part of their history. It was instrumental in the emancipation of slavery on the island. The influence of Christian missionaries on the slaves was so strong that planters forbade them from attending sermons, fearing that slaves may gain a sense of spiritual self and revolt. Despite Norval's insistence, Cedella continued to attend church, and when Norval found out, he brutally whipped her. Yet, Cedella continued attending church. Her newfound faith prohibited her from sleeping with Norval. Norval complained to her father, who advised him to beat her for holding out. Eventually, Norval relented and proposed to marry Cedella. The two were married on June 9th, 1944. Bob Marley was born Robert Nesta Marley on February 5th, 1945. Raised by his mother, Bob Marley took a keen interest in music at a very early age. Cedella had a habit of pampering and serving Bob's every whim as though he was her husband. She writes, quote, "When my husband asked for something, I simply got up and did it. But if if Bob asked, I jumped. This indulgence may have instilled a sense of entitlement in Bob, so much so that treating women as servants became completely acceptable to him. In the early 1960s, Bob Marley met Rita Anderson in Trenchtown, Jamaica. They were both aspiring musicians at the time and often crossed paths in the music scene. Rita Marley is a Jamaican singer, musician, and a philanthropist. She was born on July 25th, 1946 in Cuba and raised in Kingston, Jamaica. Rita grew up in a musical family. Her father was a musician and band leader who taught Bob Marley how to play guitar. According to people who knew them, Bob Marley was initially attracted to Rita's singing voice and her stage presence, and they began performing together in a group called the Silhouettes. Over a period of time, Bob and Rita's relationship grew closer. They eventually fell in love and married in 1966 in Kingston. Besides raising Bob Marley's children and helping him with his music career, Rita was also instrumental in helping Bob convert to Rastafarianism, which became a central aspect of Bob Marley's identity. The Rastafarian belief system came out of the ghettos of Jamaica. Essentially, Rastafarianism was created by Black people to affirm Black dignity, Black being, and Black divinity. And for them, the crowning of Haile Selassie, an African emperor in Ethiopia whose dynastic tradition links him to King Solomon and thus the line of Judah, was the fulfillment of a biblical prophecy. The word Rastafari actually translates from Ethiopian to mean Duke Tafari, with Raz meaning Duke and Tafari being Selassie's birth name. On April 21st, 1966, the Ethiopian Emperor Haile Selassie visits Jamaica. Bob Marley was out of town at the time, and Rita went to go see the emperor by herself. Rita describes seeing Selassie as the emperor's motorcade passed her on the road. She writes, quote, Haile Selassie turned in my direction and waved. There was something about the middle of his palm that struck me. I saw a black print and I said, oh my God. The Bible says that when you see him, you will know him by the nail prints in his hand. This vision of a stigmata in the palm of Haile Selassie's hand convinced Rita that he was the Messiah. She wrote about her vision to Bob, and the two decided to convert to Rastafarianism. At this point, I think it's important to acknowledge just how instrumental Rita was in helping Bob form this key aspect of his identity. Despite this mammoth contribution, Bob Marley showed very little regard for Rita as she stood by him, supported him, and raised his children, including children he fathered with other women. Fulfilling her role as the lioness in their relationship, for the duration of her marriage to Bob, Rita was mostly alone, living in poverty, working menial jobs, and raising Bob's children as his musical career propelled him into international stardom and a whirlwind of never-ending affairs. The affairs actually began almost immediately after they were married, and according to Rita, Bob got 2 women pregnant at the same time early on in their marriage. Officially, Bob Marley had 11 children who were legally acknowledged by his estate. However, when reading Rita and Cedella's book, you get the sense that he was getting women pregnant right and left. Some estimates I've seen put the final tally of children at 22. Out of these 22 children, only 3 or 4 were consummated with his wife Rita. I'll have more on this in a moment. The rest of them came from extramarital affairs. Many of his children were born in poverty and almost never saw him. Some of them would eventually be adopted by Rita and Cedella. At one point in their relationship, when Bob was doing well and living in a large house in an affluent neighborhood in Jamaica with his mistress Esther Anderson, Rita was raising their 3 children, working a menial job, and living in a small concrete shack. Desperate for money, Rita went to Bob's house to ask him for help, only to get yelled at by both Bob and Esther. Rita writes, quote, "Why don't you stop breeding?" she shouted. "All you do is breed. Bob needs a career and you need to stop breeding and let him find a life." Bob came down and said to me, "What's happening? Why are you down here trying to create a scene?" I can't imagine how humiliating this must have felt to ask your husband for money so you can care for his children only to get yelled at by his mistress. And then your husband comes down and takes his mistress's side, blaming you for creating a scene. Don Taylor, Bob Marley's manager, gives a harrowing account of the things Rita suffered at the hands of Bob. He recounts how he personally witnessed Bob beat Rita because she requested child support. According to Don, this attack was so vicious that it destroyed the hotel room where Bob and Rita were staying, requiring Bob to pay a hefty repair bill. Rita wrote a lot about how she felt depressed, deserted, and alone during this time. In her book, she paints a picture of an abandoned woman, endlessly humiliated and embarrassed by her husband's behavior. It was at this time that Rita formed a friendship and possibly a romantic relationship with one of Bob's friends, the Jamaican soccer player Owen Idol Taki. When Bob learned about their friendship, he became extremely jealous and accused Rita of infidelity. Now I want to circle back to the disputed paternity of Bob and Rita's fourth child, Stephanie Marley. But before I proceed with this part of the video, I want to give a trigger warning. This segment of the video will deal with domestic violence and sexual assault. So if you're someone who may be triggered by these topics, then please move on to the next segment. Now with that out of the way, I'm going to get into what is probably one of the darkest things I discovered about Bob Marley while researching for this video. Rita claims that Bob raped her in 1973 after she refused to have sex with him. In an interview Rita gave to Britain's Daily Mirror, she recalls how she tolerated years of infidelity until finally confronting Bob about it in 1973. After a big fight, Bob tried to have sex with her and she turned him down. Rita recalls, quote, "He said to me, 'No, you're my wife and you're supposed to.' So he forced himself on me and I call that rape. Afterwards, I felt so terrible. I screamed at him, 'I hate you, I hate you.'" Stephanie was born 9 months later on August 17, 1974. The paternity of Stephanie has been heavily disputed since. In the end, Bob Marley claimed Stephanie as his own. However, even if Stephanie wasn't Bob's biological daughter, after everything Bob had done to Rita, after all the infidelities, the children, the years of emotional, mental, and physical abuse, it's hypocritical of Bob to become so outraged by Rita's alleged infidelity. And in every way possible, whether it was her father teaching Bob to play guitar, Rita's vision convincing Bob to convert to Rastafarianism, or doing backup vocals for his band while caring for their children, Rita Marley carried Bob's burdens so he could make his music while cheating and humiliating and abusing her. In the end, he passed away in her arms in Cedars of Lebanon Hospital. Bob Marley did not leave a will because it contradicted his Rastafarian beliefs that life was eternal. A lengthy legal battle ensued after his death for the rights of his assets. His estate was subject to court fights, lawsuits, and money grabs. A lawyer and an accountant convinced Rita to forge Bob's signature on a fake estate plan. The fraud was discovered, Rita confessed, and lost her stake. After years of legal wrangling, Rita finally managed to get her stake back, and now shares control of the estate with 9 of Bob's children, most of whom are not hers. And somehow, even after his death, Rita the Lion was forced to claw and fight tooth and nail to secure resources for her family. Even now, articles are published questioning her behavior and labeling her litigious and grubby, overlooking her contribution to Bob's career and treating her like an entitled and materialistic gold digger. And that's not to denigrate Bob Marley's incredible accomplishments. He rose from poverty to become one of the most celebrated musicians in world history. His message is still important and still provides meaning not only for people in the African diaspora, but for all of humanity. Yet, Rita and Cedella's stories play into a pattern we see more broadly reflected in society, where too often Black women are subjected to higher rates of domestic violence, single motherhood, social ridicule, and disrespect. Our contributions are often minimized and erased, and yet we remain regal, strong, and beautiful, striving for dignity while carrying the weight of our families, our culture, and the legacy of the diaspora on our backs. And on that note, I want to say thank you for joining me for this episode of The Cosmic Everything. I plan on bringing you more thoughtful and thought-provoking visual essays dealing with celebrities, philosophy, history, and anything else I find interesting. And if you enjoyed this content, please hit that like button, subscribe, and I will see you next time. Peace.